Hi, my name is Ellen Crain, and I'm going to be talking to you about homeschooling. This talk is Homeschooling 101 for marketers and parents. And just a little bit about myself. I have 3 kids that I never sent to school. 2 of them are in college now at Hamlin at the U, and my baby's just starting 9th grade. I've been homeschooling in the Twin Cities metro for, 20 years, just about. I'm very familiar with that community, and I am a former board member of the Minnesota Homeschoolers Alliance, and I've run a homeschool co-op, which is sort of like a one-day-a-week school. And for the last 5 years, I've been running Homeschool Boss, which is we offer standardized testing to homeschool families across the country. So I'm familiar with homeschooling from a lot of different perspectives. And I'll just kind of go through both some of the things that people get confused about with homeschooling and what you kind of want to know. So if you're jumping into it, either because you're looking at homeschooling your own child or because you'd like to sell to homeschoolers. So one of the first things people get confused about is what exactly homeschooling is. When I use the word homeschooling, I am talking about a form of private schooling. So it is when a parent doesn't enroll their child in a school and provides their education privately. They just, in the same way that it's sort of the difference between if you eat at home versus going to a restaurant. Even if you are you may cook everything from scratch or grow it in your garden, or you could just, stop at the grocery store and buy stuff that is prepared and ready to go. There's a big range, but you're not eating at a restaurant. But people frequently get confused between homeschooling and other forms of teaching your kid at home. There is also, as we're all very aware, virtual schooling, which districts are now offering, and then online virtual charters like the Minnesota Virtual Academy that has been around for a while. And those are public options that it's sort of like during normal times, people who are virtual schooling often will consider themselves homeschoolers and and hang out with homeschoolers. But technically, from a legal perspective, their education is being overseen by a school, and the school is paying for that. So it is, from a legal perspective, they are not homeschoolers. They are they're public school students who are getting their education at home. And then there are also private, just to add confusion, there are private schools you can enroll your child in that are, some of them are even accredited, and frequently they aren't doing the right paperwork in Minnesota for it to count as enrolling your child in the school. So you're still a homeschooler, even though your child could theoretically get a diploma from some virtual school in Virginia or Omaha or something. So yes, I feel like I'm just making things more confusing. But yes, if your child is not enrolled in a school that is based in Minnesota, and you are filling out paperwork for the state to avoid truancy charges, then your child is homeschooled. And all the other options, your child is technically being educated by a school. And so they are not, from a legal standpoint, homeschoolers. However, there's a lot of overlap from a marketing standpoint between these virtual schoolers and homeschoolers. They frequently attend the same, because they're available in the middle of the day, they'll attend a lot of the same activities, and will, maybe take classes, the same kind of online classes and that kind of thing. So I hope that was sort of clear. And homeschooling is legal in all 50 states. And it is one of the things people are frequently surprised about when they start homeschooling or when they start looking into homeschooling is how little paperwork there is, because the idea is that you as a parent are taking on the responsibility of educating your child. And so the state isn't offering that much oversight. And there's a range of opinions about that, but that is how it works generally in our country. So who homeschools? Homeschooling has generally been a fringe community. So we have people who are, if you have a kid who's right in the middle, who's a pretty mainstream kid, and you're a pretty mainstream family, schools tend to work pretty well for your family. But people who have kids, if your kid has special needs or is highly gifted or both, or if, you have a parent works strange hours and so, not that 9 to 5, and having your kid enrolled in school means that you're never going to see them, or that you travel a lot and you want to be able to bring your family with you. Those are families that we see a lot in homeschooling. We also see people who have kids with medical issues, kids with careers, or who are very involved in acting or sports. And we also see people who homeschool for philosophical reasons or religious reasons. We tend to be, and probably more than our share of people who are autistic or just generally find that school environment kind of unpleasant. Anybody with sensory issues are more likely to choose to homeschool. So it's a really varied group. And you can't just aim for the middle. And one of the things that's really nice as a homeschool parent is that my kids are completely comfortable with neurodiversity. They don't expect everybody at the same age to be in the same place. They aren't competitive that way. And that's I see that as a benefit, but it is a real difference. The other way, if you ever want to, if you're wondering if somebody's homeschooled, the kid's homeschooled, ask them what grade they're in. Because, they frequently they either need to stop and think and do some math, or they have no idea. So it's sort of funny. And one thing that's interesting is that people don't necessarily expect is, from a statistical standpoint, homeschool families are slightly more likely to have 2 incomes than non-homeschool families. So I can't explain it. It's kind of surprising to me, but it is, that's what the statistics say. And where you find homeschoolers. One of the biggest, there's a lot of variety of opinions right now about Facebook, but that is where the online homeschool communities are right now. So if you are looking to reach homeschoolers, either as a business or as a person, Facebook is the place to do it. It's the easiest place. You can, if you're looking to start homeschooling, I run a great big Minnesota Homeschoolers Facebook group. There are a lot of Facebook groups on homeschool. there are a lot of homeschooling groups on Facebook. And that's an easy way to just kind of dive in and start asking questions. If, as a marketer, I would strongly encourage you to just pay for ads. It's easy to target homeschoolers on Facebook, and there are so many businesses that come and want to just post in these groups that there tends to be a lot of controls about spam. So if you don't want to antagonize homeschool leaders, it's easier just to pay or message and ask if they'll post something. But follow the rules, because frankly, we get a lot of it, and so we get a lot of people trying to kind of sneak under the radar, and it gets old and we get grumpy. And the other places in normal times, other ways to find homeschoolers is you can ask your local librarian. Because homeschoolers tend to use the library a lot, they might kind of know about groups. And you can just Google for various groups in your area. In the Twin Cities, there is a website called Homeschool Adventures. It's hsadventures.org that has a huge event calendar. And it also lists a lot of groups, and it's a really valuable resource if you don't want to go on Facebook and you want to find some people. That's a good place to start. And also, if you're, as a business, if you were trying to connect with homeschoolers, you could put together an event and message them to add it to their calendar, and they would help promote it. And that would be free. All right. Okay, I'm going a little fast. The major styles of homeschooling, because it's a big community, there are a lot of different ways to do it. There are some people who do what we call school at home, which is where you buy textbooks and you essentially are just replicating that school environment at home. So you'll have maybe even the same textbooks that the schools offer, and you just go through, you have a routine and cover each subject every day and do pretty much the same work. That is probably, that's a way that a lot of people start homeschooling, and it's not a way that a lot of people stick to. Another option is classical schooling, which is essentially they follow ideas about education from probably about 100 years ago. Sometimes it's called Charlotte Mason schooling, because she had a particular flavor of this that was actually super trendy about 120 years ago. And classical homeschooling involves reading a lot of classics, and frequently they will also learn Latin. And there is an idea that the brain kind of goes through phases. And so when kids are young, what they're ready to do is just learn facts. And then you sort of, as you get older, become more able to analyze. And so the early age education tends to be just about learning facts, and they don't ask for analysis, and it just moves on like that. Another place to do classical education, there's a franchise, kind of a franchise-based homeschool co-op called Classical Connections, and it is a Christian organization. Another thing to be aware of is that in the homeschool world, there are basically two communities. There is the Christian homeschooling community, and there is everybody else. And the Christian homeschooling community is largely evangelical, young earth creationist, non-denominational Christians. So just to break that down so you know what young earth creationists are, they believe that the Bible is literally true, and that you can gauge the age of the earth by just counting back generations in the Bible. And so when you're looking at curriculum, if you want that, it's very easy to find. And if you don't want that, you need to watch for it, because young earth, because the Christian community dominates textbooks enough that they tend to, it's not always labeled that things are Christian. So you need to kind of look for code words. If it says, anything about, if it mentions God or worldview or creation, then it's probably from that young earth creationist standpoint. And so you should be aware of that. And it does impact both, obviously, since they don't believe in evolution, it's going to impact science texts. It also impacts physics, because there's a different way of, they have a way of explaining why carbon dating isn't correct. And obviously history will start at Adam and Eve. So just, when you're looking at curriculum, that is a fairly large part of the market. And then there's the more traditional classical textbooks. Charlotte Mason Charlotte Mason dates back before the young earth creationist idea was really around. She doesn't hurt if you find materials that are the Charlotte Mason method, they don't tend to be young earth. And then there's another kind of sect of the classical method called the well-trained mind, which is also not a young earth creationist. Aside from that, another method is Waldorf, which is there's Waldorf and Montessori kind of homeschooling, where they take the same methods that you'll see in Waldorf and Montessori schools and then apply them to homeschooling. And that tends to be very experiential in the early grades and project-based. And then another major kind of homeschooling is called unschooling, and this is a method that tends to shock people when they first hear about it, but in practice, it's not as radical as it sounds. Unschooling, one explanation for it, I think is probably as good as any, is that it is educating your child as if schools didn't exist. So you just set aside the whole idea of grade levels and keeping up with that there's some specific thing that fourth graders need to know, and instead you teach your child what makes sense for them to know next based on their interests and what's going on in your household and sort of what's going on in the world. And that can also be called child-led learning or natural learning. And they may or may not use textbooks or any kind of curriculum. And it's not unusual for unschoolers to go from being, years behind from a school perspective to right at grade level or even way above. I've known a few unschooled kids who, couldn't read at 9. And then by the time they were 12, they were way, way ahead of their peers in their reading ability. So it seems really radical, but it works out. the advantage of what basically the idea behind unschooling is fish swim, birds fly, people learn, and that kids will naturally want to learn things when it is useful and they're ready to learn it. And it can also be a really great perspective for kids who have learning disabilities or, other disabilities, because it just sort of, it really puts the emphasis on addressing the needs in front of you. So that is, especially if you're marketing to unschoolers, it's good to sort of think of it in that way, and actually even if you're just meeting unschoolers, that the idea is that they're trying to meet the needs in front of them as opposed to getting their agenda from somewhere on the outside. And then there's, as probably the most popular version of homeschooling is Eclectic, where you're taking little bits from different things. So there are a lot of people who, while pure unschoolers hate this, there are a lot of people who feel like they are unschooling everything but math, or they are unschooling, their kids' 3 favorite subjects, and being more school at home with the other things. So there's a lot of blending. And yeah, the main takeaway is homeschooling does not look like school a lot of the time. And that doesn't mean that they aren't learning and that they aren't ready for college and that kind of thing. I know it's anecdotal, but for my kids, one of the biggest problems they had in college was suddenly being treated like high school students, because they'd been used to being having a lot more freedom than that. And in your freshman year, the colleges are trying to provide structure and help kids transition from a very structured environment in a traditional high school to having lots of freedom. And suddenly my kids felt pretty penned in. So that was interesting. Let's see. The history of homeschooling. Well, obviously, way back when there were no schools, so homeschooling was all there was. And then, if you read and that homeschooling was pretty common, in the 1800s, and then as schools came in around 1900s, it became less common. A lot of people don't know that that Teddy Roosevelt's daughter, Alice, was homeschooled in the White House. She was probably the last kid homeschooled in the White House, unless you count Barron, with whatever he's doing. And then as the mandatory schooling came in, homeschooling became more difficult. There have always been people who have been sort of, homeschooling under the radar. But then in the 70s, a man named John Holt came through, and he was basically leading hippies in homeschooling. And that's where the unschooling method came from. Unschooling was actually named during, for people who are old like me, there was an ad campaign where they advertised 7-Up as the Uncola. And so unschooling was supposed to be in the same way, it was, it meets the same needs, but is purer. And then in the 80s, the IRS made a law change that closed a lot of small Christian schools. And those parents didn't necessarily want to put their kids in public school. And so they took advantage of the law changes that had been pushed in a large degree by those John Holtz hippies to start homeschooling their children. And the curriculum publishers that had been publishing textbooks for those small Christian schools suddenly, they shifted also to selling curriculum to those schools. And so while the unschooling hippies they'd been just making do with books they could get from the library and that kind of thing. Suddenly with the, as Christians entered the market, entered homeschooling, they became more of a homeschool market because the curriculum publishers came with them. And that was when homeschooling became a big evangelical Christian thing. And now, over the last 10 years, there's, as the internet comes on, obviously it's much, much easier to homeschool because we can all get all kinds of things so much more easily. There are a lot of online curriculums, that kind of thing. So there has been more, there's been a move towards more mainstream homeschooling. And from what I'm seeing in my business, it appears, and also the homeschool group, that it appears that COVID has really accelerated that a lot. And so I think there are going to be many, many more mainstream homeschoolers who are, people who are basically the other category, not necessarily Christian homeschoolers, but people who are homeschooling more for academic reasons or because their kids are just not happy in school for one reason or other. And I think that's going to be where the next big growth is in the homeschool market. So I'm looking forward to that because that is sort of those are more my people in the homeschooling world to some degree. And let's see. All right, how to avoid sticking your foot in your mouth when talking to homeschoolers. The main thing is, I'm going to try and be quick. Anytime you're talking to any niche market, the first 5 things that you are sure they have problems with are solved. You just need to assume that. And so for homeschoolers, the prom's not a problem. Socializing in general isn't a problem. And there are a lot of solutions to teaching high school math and science. So you don't want to lead in with that. And you don't want to assume necessarily that they are homeschooling because they are whatever your stereotype is of homeschoolers. So lots of homeschoolers, while there are certainly a lot of hippie homeschoolers, the person you're talking to doesn't necessarily identify that way. And while there are a lot of very religious homeschoolers, not everybody is religious either. So we don't all have 7 kids. There's a tremendous variety in the homeschool community. And so you just don't want to make any assumptions, ask people questions. All right, I am happy to answer questions if anybody has any. You can just kind of blurt them out. Otherwise, if you think of something, my email address is ellen@homeschoolboss.com, and I'm happy to answer questions there too. And my homeschool group on Facebook is Minnesota Homeschoolers, so we're pretty easy to find. And yeah, as long as you aren't looking to spam us, pretty much anybody can join. And I am about out of time here, so I should probably say goodbye.